introducing me quickly.
Okay, that's fine.
I must apologize, I can't stay, but
Okay.
good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I must apologize that I have to leave you after introducing because I have class, but I'll see the video, which is always a good thing. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janet Bauer to our community, and I am very excited that we're going to hear some more about Trinbagonian Muslim feminists. And this is important especially because of the cultural ideas that surround who is a feminist and who can be. Professor Bauer is Professor in International Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and the former director of Trinity's Women, Gender and Sexuality program. She teaches or conducts ethnographic research and publishes on gender and mobility in Muslim societies, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas. She's been everywhere. As a visiting Fulbright Global Scholar, welcome, stay with us for a while. She's currently working on a multi-sited research project on gender and race in Muslim diasporas in Trinidad and Tobago, Canada, Germany, and the US. She also serves as a moderator for the Honest Conversations with Your Muslim Neighbor series and is a member of Hartford's Commission for Refugee and Immigration Affairs. I invite you to listen to Professor Bauer's presentation and ask a lot of questions. Because I'm going to leave and not here to moderate, as soon as you finish your presentation, which is about 20 to 30 minutes, then the floor will be open for questions. So you can, do the professor thing.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming, and do have a good session.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So glad to have. Why don't you come on up to the table? Even if you have to leave early, we'll be closer together. When I first started doing work in Trinidad and Tobago around 2002, I wrote a piece called Global Sightings about Muslim women in Trinidad and Tobago, in which I was trying to place them in the context of global conversations on feminism, and Muslim feminism in particular. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to continue coming to Trinidad over the last 15 years. And this has allowed me to sort of follow and uncover some of the paradoxes of women's engagement, Muslim women's engagement with what I call heritage Islam. And I'll refer to the definition I've used in writing so that I present it accurately. But when I say heritage Islam, I'm referring to an individual's conscious reassessment of authoritative religious traditions and texts in order to define and create their relationship to their Islamic heritage. In this presentation, I want to emphasize two things. One is the importance of ethnographic research, participant observation, multi-sited and longitudinal research in uncovering some of these nuances. And the second thing is highlighting the contributions of what I'm generally calling Islamic feminism or Muslim women's engagement with Islamic heritage in discussions about rights and possibilities for addressing the challenges that exist in both Islam and in feminism, as described for the latter by the Moroccan sociologist Fatma Mirnasi when she said the big challenges confronting traditional hierarchies and states and politicians are the challenge of women and gender and the challenge of pluralism, race and class diversity. So as I mentioned, ethnographic research has been really an important part of my journey in Trinidad. I guess some people see it as a kind of storytelling or trying to capture the stories of other people. And someone I was interviewing just the other day said to me, tell my story, not your story. Which is a reminder that we're trying to capture how other people understand and see their life and their possibilities. But on the other hand, I'm trying to put this in a context, so I can't avoid telling it as my story as well. And as you'll see at the end, I have been collaborating with some people who have been very important in this endeavor as sounding boards and as colleagues. And of course, I also want to acknowledge a lot of the women associated with this institute who have done seminal work on Muslim women making spaces for themselves, as well as on the importance of paying attention to race and racial diversity. So I've been focusing on Trinidadian Muslim women's engagement with heritage Islam in the changing context that was affected, I think, first by the post-1979 religious, and in particular Muslim revival, or revivalism. And this was a revival that for some people focused very much on neo-traditionalism, or some people have said halalization of tradition, that is going back to something that is pure and authentic. It occurred in a changing global context with Islamophobia, fear of Islam, misunderstanding of Islam, as well as the increase in global availability of text and sources of information and so on, which you see through internet sources. So a great deal of knowledge is available. A great deal of knowledge about Islam is available to people, to Muslims all over the world. And as we go forward, as I've gone forward with my research, I see that we are entering or have entered a period of what S.F. Bayat calls post-Islamism. And by that, he means a period in which people are trying to fuse, and I'm quoting him now, religiosity and rights, faith and freedom, Islam and liberty, and which addresses rights instead of duties, plurality in place of a singular authoritative voice, historicity rather than fixed scripture, and the future instead of the past. And in some ways, I'm suggesting that this trajectory, as it's, I think, beginning to emerge in Trinidad and has emerged elsewhere, leads to the possibility of kind of convergence around the issue of rights. Although people are coming from different positions and have different understandings, it leads to a kind of convergence which might allow for greater dialogue among feminists from different traditions. My project in Trinidad is set in a comparative context. I came to Trinidad with Iran as my touchstone, because I had done my previous work in Southeast Asia, in the southern Philippines, in Iran, in Turkey, and in Europe and Canada. And so I am now engaged in this Fulbright project, which I've called Social Geographies of Islam and Diaspora, Race, Gender, Generation, and Place, in which I'm looking at Muslim women's engagement with Islam from very different perspectives in different kinds of diasporas. So I'm focusing on a range of women, and as you'll see in a moment, I am trying to include women that span, Muslim women who might span the spectrum from those who are Islamists to those who are Muslim feminists to those who are looking outside of the framework of Islam for improvement in women's rights and empowerment and so on. In all of those places, I have engaged in what I say is multi-sided, longitudinal ethnography, which means I have been doing participant observation where I've been living with people, returning to interview the same people over several generations in different locations, trying to also capture youth's perspective, which I've been trying to focus on during this visit in Trinidad. And the multi-sided nature of it allows for, I think, greater insights in terms of the comparison, the contrast among people in different locations. In trying to locate, and I've gotten ahead without bringing forward my slides, in trying to locate Islamic feminism in Trinidad, I want to locate it in the larger global perspective. I think to some extent that there's been a great deal of misrecognition of not only Muslim women, but Muslim women activists in their various projects by both, I will say, Eastern and Western women. So it's not just Western women who have these misunderstandings. Many women that I talk to here who in the different communities who know that I've worked in Iran often sort of express sympathy with Iranian women because they're oppressed and they don't have any opportunities and so on, which is the same kind of stereotype that is also directed toward them by others as well. And I think partly this comes out of the work that was done on religious fundamentalism in the 1990s, especially on Muslim fundamentalism. And the idea was that there was this revival in the 80s and 90s of religion as the language of social change or of creating identities and changing one's circumstances, especially for those people who had been left out of the conversation. And a part of that was going back to fundamentals that meant text. If you had a textual tradition, it might mean oral tradition if you had an oral tradition. And it was characterized by many of the authors as reactionary, anti-modern, a return to the past. But if you look at the work that's been done on women involved in some of these communities, including fundamentalist Mormons, Hindus, Christians, Muslims in different communities around the world, you see that women's involvement in communities that were exploring fundamentals or using fundamentals of their tradition were using it very much to go forward into the future, to the present and future, and not as a return to the past. It is true that one of the things that links fundamentalist traditions is the focus on women as a source of, as a measure of how well the community is doing. So women's roles, women's behavior become a focus, and most fundamentalist expressions in different religious traditions do focus on gender and sexual binaries. So there is an assumption that men and women are actually created differently and designed for different roles in society. And so that's one of the things that women in many religious traditions struggle with if they are sort of looking at the fundamentals of their religious tradition. I am using Islamic fundamentalism in a broad sense. I like to refer to an Egyptian, an Egyptian social scientist who talks about Egyptian feminism in terms of Islamist feminists who want to find women's rights within a narrow textual tradition that exists in Islam. Muslim feminists, as Muslim women who want to take the principles of Islam and use them to further empower women or support their agency and rights, which means you're open to a little more interpretation and fluidity in terms of how you look at the tradition. And then secular feminists, who are those who see the limitations, quite frankly, of most patriarchal religious traditions, where men are the ultimate authorities and their interpretations have carried more weight historically. And so those feminists look outside of the religious traditions. I would point out that people like Badran, who've studied Egyptian feminism historically, point out that turn of the century feminists in Muslim countries did not see any contradiction between their religion and feminism. So there wasn't a notion that these were contradictory ideas, and that has changed for some people over time. Let me mention, in terms of locating Islamic feminism or Muslim feminism in Trinidad, just a few examples of what's going on in the rest of the world as a touchstone. And I'll be making some comments about multicultural contexts and also about creolization and decreolization, so that I can then talk about the case the case of Muslim feminists in Trinidad and Tobago. So there has been a re-engagement by women of their heritage Islam or textual traditions and so forth worldwide. So we see examples from all over the world of women learning to read the Quran for themselves and engaging in sometimes engaging in interpretation and application. And this has had the effect in many places of providing women with a basis for enhancing their status within the community. So in Hainan, China, for example, these Muslim women who were actually usually traders, so they had quite a bit of sort of autonomy in terms of going to the market and doing business, began to learn Arabic and become teachers of Arabic in their community, which enhanced their status as women in that community. I want to focus here on three examples, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Iran, just to talk about how more recently Muslim women and Muslim women's organizations have gone further to really question and challenge authoritative interpretations of text and authorities in their communities. So in Malaysia, there's an organization called Sisters in Islam, and they have taken on the challenge of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. They have made a decision to focus on the Sunnah, or the traditions from the life and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and to look at the contradictions sometimes of the fiqh that developed after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, and what they see as his original intentions in his life and in his expression, which they see as that of equality, not only equality in the Muslim community, but also equality, gender equality, not just in the spiritual sense, which is often emphasized in more conservative thinking, Muslim thinking, but in other senses as well, and sort of a broader kind of equality. And so they are challenged sometimes by, for example, one of the ulama, and I have brought some of the texts along from which I will be speaking that I'd like to donate to the IGDS library that might be interesting to people who want to look at Islamic feminism in this broader context. So in Malaysia, which is a pluralistic society, only slightly Muslim majority, there are ulama who say that women must provide sexual relations to their husbands, that there is no such thing as marital rape. But there are other ulama who support sort of the Sisters in Islam position that say that Islam must respect the rights of everyone, that Islam is a religion that cares for others, and that gender justice is prescribed by Allah. So they are finding some religious authorities that are supporting their position in challenging some aspects of sort of accepted jurisprudence, but also traditions as well. In Indonesia, this is taken even further by some groups who are looking at traditions that existed in perhaps in the countryside. Some people would call it folk Islam, as sort of practices that don't really contradict the basic teachings of Islam in any significant way. And so unlike those who are focusing on more narrow textual interpretations, they're trying to find ways to incorporate what some people would see in Trinidad as the creolization of their tradition. And I use this term creolization and decreolization, which is the attempt to get rid of cultural elements that are seen as not central to religious, or in this case Islamic practice, because they were used by Frank Coram, who was an anthropologist doing work on Ashura or Jose in Trinidad. And he points out that this set of terms, which comes from actually the field of linguistics, to look at social change, sort of preserves what he says is the dynamism and agency of individuals. So they're really terms that focus on, to some extent, social change. So presently, as you'll see in just a moment, there is, I think, in Trinidad, among those institutions that are sort of the centers for Islamic learning and teaching here in Trinidad, to decreolize, to take out those elements of practice that they say have nothing to do with Islam, and to define Islam in a more narrow way. And creolization as sort of the approach that there are changes and accommodations that need to be made, some of them very pragmatic. As one imam said to me the other day, who also is sort of narrow in terms of his application of teaching, of course women can drive a car. Aisha got up on a camel, and today the camel is the car. So of course we have to make these accommodations. So I am using Islamic or Muslim feminism here to refer to women who are active both as members of groups and as individuals in trying to enhance the position, the opportunity, the rights of women by some reference to Islam as a framework. So I'm focusing not so much on more secular Muslim women activists, but on those who see themselves as operating within the framework of Islam. I'm going to go forward just a moment to give you a sense, as I talk a little bit about the unique context of Trinidad, the pictures of women in different organizations. So of course you see me with one of the teachers who was trained at Dar Laloum, which is one of the centers of credentialing and learning, Islamic learning in Trinidad and Tobago, where Deobandi thinking is fostered. And so a very narrow way of applying text and understanding text, and in many people's mind also supporting the wearing of niqab or the full face veil, as well as plural marriage. And that picture was taken in outside of Port of Spain at a maktab where she was providing education for girls. And here, of course, is Nurun Amir Ali, who was the first Muslim woman to give a public lecture in Trinidad in 1933, which, of course, was not covered in the newspapers. I went down to the National Archives last week to try to find if any newspapers had covered such an event. And you can see she's wearing more of an urni kind of hijab, which reflects sort of the traditional Indian hijab of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is from IRS Sports Day, taken from behind. So you see a diversity of attire, some niqab, their faces facing forward, and other kinds of hijab as well. So this is just a way of introducing the uniqueness of the environment, the Muslim environment in Trinidad and Tobago. Not only is there great diversity among jamaats or organizations and societies, but also a great deal of racial diversity. And at the same time, one of the things that is so striking, and Gabrielle and I were talking about this when I first arrived, is what someone said to me: all the Muslims know all the other Muslims, or everybody knows everybody in the community. And in theoretical terms, people refer to that as cultural or social intimacy. But it does mean that people are related by marriage or residential location to so many different people. And that changes the way it changes or presents a unique multicultural context. So my comparative focus has been on Muslim minority societies, and Muslim minority societies in Canada, Germany, Trinidad, and America that are very different in terms of multiculturalism. That is, in terms of how other people know about each other's cultures and how the state provides support for the practice of different cultures. So we can have pluralistic context, as we do in Indonesia and Malaysia, and Egypt and Iran, which is the other case I wanted to talk about, we'll refer to later on. but they are not necessarily multicultural or polycultural, where people are sharing knowledge about each other's culture and also not so desperate in terms of the political power that they enjoy. So in Trinidad, I have done participant observation and interviewed people in Tobago and Trinidad at traditional Sunni masjids and women's organizations under the sort of the umbrella organizations of ASJA, TML, and TIA. But I've also worked with the Shia mission down in Nelson Street, the Islamic Resource Society, Jamaat al-Muslimin, the Nation of Islam. All of these organizations reflect the extent to which Islam in Trinidad at the current moment is somewhat racially segregated in terms of the different Jamaats that people attend. And that's beginning to change, I think, in particular ways that I'll mention in just a moment. In addition, I have also visited and worked with the Ahmadi and independent communities in Rio Claro and other parts of Trinidad and Tobago. So it's given me a chance to talk with people who have a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds and who also have a variety of perspectives, because it includes a number of what people themselves would call reverts, those individuals who are coming back to Islam in one of two senses. There is a belief that all of us are Muslims and we may not know it and may not have come to Islam yet, and also that many Trinidadians of African ancestry might have descended from Muslims who were brought here as slaves, and they are then reverting to the religion of their families. Okay, so I have four main points that I want to make, and I'll try to make them quickly so we can have some discussion. First of all is the importance of what I've called circuits of piety. Halima Saadia Qasim, who also is a graduate, I think, of IGDS and works at the University of the West Indies, has done a lot of work on the historical circulation of missionaries and students who came to Trinidad, bringing a renewal of faith, that is new information. But that process obviously has accelerated with the internet and with airplanes. So there are, a constant stream of individuals. I think just 2 weeks ago there was the Islamic Dawa movement seminar where two speakers, one from the US and one from England, I believe, came. I know Mufti Mink has been here for conferences and is also available online. Khalid Hussein is coming. So these are names that vary in popularity over time and have visited, appeared on IBN or TIN, the two Islamic television stations. And in addition to the circulation of information, has been the growth of Dar al-Ulum and some other institutions of Islamic learning and teaching, which have focused, particularly in the case of Dar al-Ulum, on what I would call Deobandi thinking. Deobandi and Tablighi movements come out of South Asia as missionary movements. And they tend to sort of focus on more narrow interpretations of text and application to the lives of men and women in the community. But they are the one of the more influential sources of training here in Trinidad. So throughout all of the Jamaats and organizations that I've visited and participated in, they seem to produce the largest number of teachers. So they're obviously influential. But one of the ironies of this, in this sort of what some people would call the halalization of knowledge or neo-traditionalism of knowledge, which may seem to offer women in particular a more narrow range of options, is the way in which getting trained as an alima or getting trained in Islamic knowledge gives you a certain status in society. So what I see happening is that many women, in particular from non-traditional families or from revert families or from increasing numbers of women, of Muslim women of African ancestry, are able to get this training that gives them a certain status in the community. So this is one way in which women may be thinking or trying to conform their behavior to more narrow limits in terms of how they conduct themselves, whether they wear niqab, whether they travel alone without a mahram or a family member. On the other hand, it is a source of enhancing women's status in some ways as well. Here is an example of, oh, no, okay, sorry, I had another slide. I guess I put up the wrong PowerPoint. I had a slide which provided one of the lessons, and I'll see if I can find that very quickly, which talks about women's rights. And from one of the lessons that was provided by a Dar al Uloom trained teacher. And this was where there was an incident about a woman who entered upon the Prophet's wife, Aisha, and Aisha noticed that she wasn't dressed very well, or she was dressed carelessly, and Aisha asked the woman what was wrong, and the woman said that her husband was so religiously devoted that he forgot about her altogether, and that he would be fasting or he would be praying and he would forget about her. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, summoned the woman's husband and asked him, "Do you not take me for your good model? You should give your wife her due rights." And the next day the woman came to Aisha with good apparel and a nice smell, and when Aisha asked her what had happened, she answered that her husband had fulfilled her rights. And in some ways that reflects the notion that rights, not only are rights provided in Islam, but in this interpretation that the rights are provided through negotiation with the husband or protection of the husband, which is in some ways removes some of the agency that women might otherwise enjoy. This impact of having training in terms of destabilizing the leadership positions of women from traditional families and from Indian families in particular is reflected in what I have called the dueling women's groups and the debate over qasidas, because what is reflected in the teaching that I just mentioned is this attempt to focus on decreolization to some extent, to focus on some narrow teachings and applications. Although in this case it seems to come, I think, from the Sunnah and not from the Quran. But in one of the masjids where I have been visiting for some time and also attending classes, I served for since 2006 or 2007, there were two women's groups. And one was led by a more traditional family, been important in founding the masjid, and who had been leaders in that community. And the second was created by a woman who was from a non-traditional family, non-elite family, but who had been trained at Dar al Uloom. And she was also a teacher at the school. And the debate that emerged into this kind of dueling relationship between the two groups focused to some extent on things like qasidas. Was it appropriate to sing these songs, poetry about the life of the Prophet Muhammad? Was that religiously appropriate or not? Did it violate some basic tenets of Islam in terms of showing too much attention to the Prophet Muhammad? Or was it part of cultural tradition, which many people saw it as reflecting things that visiting sheikhs in the 1930s and 1950s had said were appropriate. And these were traditions that had come by way of Pakistan and South Asia, India. And let me just relate a little bit about the teacher and her view, and then from the daughter of one of the traditional leaders who herself is now a leader in the alternative women's organization. So the new group, which I'll call the Sisters group, in contrast to the older group I'll call the Ladies group. In the Sisters group, I attended some years ago a celebration for a Hafiza, a young woman who had just memorized the Quran. And in the materials, in the brochure, was mentioned that the, quote, other women's rights, and by that they meant women's rights within Islam as opposed to a more feminist, what they saw as a more feminist notion of rights or acquiring rights outside of Islam. And that is the right to be obedient and loyal wives and mothers. And their vision for their organization was to be a dynamic Islamic association addressing the diverse needs of women. And their mission was to attract all sisters, I'm quoting now, towards the deen of Allah by empowering them through education, participation, and support, thereby creating an enlightened woman and forging a stronger family. So again, there was a focus on enhancing women's agency and empowering them, but also a more narrow view of what was possible for women, and so encouraging niqab and encouraging women to accept plural marriage, since it was part of the Sunnah and the Quran. I'll just briefly give you some reflections from the daughter of one of the founders of the ladies group. And although I noticed in more recent years she's been wearing tighter hijab and has been telling me that the groups are getting along better, which is a reflection, I think, of convergence among different women's groups over time. She told me that the position of the sisters group, especially regarding the singing of qasidas at rituals, was itself un-Islamic and bid'ah, or innovation, because qasidas had been sanctioned practices in the tradition of the South Asian families. And then she began talking about the niqab as Arab cultural influence. So why are we complaining about South Asian cultural influence when there is this Arab cultural influence as well? As I've continued to visit different groups and also seen the changes that have occurred, for example, in the relationship, although tense, somewhat more accommodating relationship between the ladies' organization and the sisters' association, I've started to pay attention to the next generation. Just last week, in fact, I was at a class for converts when one of the young women in niqab, totally in black, a revert of African descent, said that she was learning the names of the caliphs, the Muslim caliphs, from a spoken word poetry on a CD. And this is a reflection, in some ways, or a visual reminder, an audio, sort of audio reminder of the ways in which technology, which appeals to a new generation, is having an impact on perhaps or supporting, opening up, encouraging sort of a different perspectives, new perspectives in terms of pursuing and acquiring knowledge that affects particularly women in their tradition. So for example, I want to use a couple of examples as I've moved around youth organizations, particularly this visit. Although the first one comes from a few years ago when Aisha, who is an Afro-Trinidadian from the Islamic Resource Society, who was active in community organizations and had appeared on television programs, and she, in the television program that I saw was discussing HIV/AIDS awareness programs. She was challenged later online by Muslim men who said she should not have appeared on television, that women should not appear on television. And she was not reluctant to engage them in debate and explain why it was all right for women to be on television, and to reject the notion that women should not be seen and should only focus on the home and the household. A couple of years ago, I also attended a workshop organized by women who had been trained at Dar al-Ulum. And interestingly enough, there was an attempt to appeal to young women, to bring them in to discuss various aspects of religion and women's position, rights for women. And the name, I don't know if any of you attended it, the name of the workshop was True Love, and it centered on true love for the Prophet Muhammad. And so it used poetry, it used music, it talked about Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad is the ideal man. So interesting way to teach some things about behavior for women and behavior in relationships, and focusing on the Sunnah, are the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, by using poetry and music and kind of this hip way of stylizing love in terms of comparing your love for the prophets to love you may develop for other people. I also had most recently an opportunity to visit the revival of the Ummah youth group, who were engaged in all kinds of community service in Trinidad. And in talking to them, it became clear there's some controversy, I think, over the extent to which men and women work together in that organization on some of their activities. But as one of the young women said, we have to, we ride in taxis with men, we work with men, we have to have a more natural sort of, we have to be used to working with men all the time, and we have to see that we can conduct ourselves appropriately in this manner. But there are other young people that I've talked to individually who are questioning some of the Deobandi style teaching and talking more about accommodation, more about living in Trinidad and needing to accommodate our understanding of Islam, taking the Islamic principles and applying them to the lives of young men and young women in Trinidad and Tobago. So one of the things I'm arguing, which is reflected here in terms of post-Islamic feminism and dialogue, but I think I have it on the next page as a takeaway or conclusion, which I'm going to suggest right now, is that Trinidadian Muslim women's engagement with Heritage Islam has provided some diverse and interesting ways for women to enhance their lives and their status within the community. And while there have been some encouragement for limitations, imposing limitations on yourself in terms of traveling alone, for example, I see that women and young men and women in particular are beginning to question this and to ask more questions, to think of new ways of incorporating or applying Islam in their lives, and in particular devising mechanisms like the ROU, which has a conference every year. It has camps. It is also dedicated to bringing together Muslim youth from across Jamaats as a model perhaps for wider interfaith dialogue and interconnection as well. So I'm suggesting that women who traditionally started in the 50s and 60s doing Dawa within their community and outside, focusing on social service. That was the earlier generation of leaders that Halima and Rhoda and Gabby have written about, focused on gender, are moving beyond that to engage the text question the text, perhaps not quite at the same place as Sisters of Islam or the Iranian women who were involved in the 1 million signature campaign, which was my third example, where secular and religious activists came together to try to get support for expanding women's legal rights in Iran. So I'm suggesting that there is a space for convergence, if you will. I think this moment of focus on decreolization will be opening up into creolization as young people from different organizations talk to each other. And I also think that this is providing a venue for sort of destabilizing the racial segregation within the different Muslim communities in Trinidad and Tobago. Not only as young people everywhere in the world are more comfortable interacting, have more experiences with people across different racial and ethnic groups in Trinidad, but also as people come together, they're learning together in classrooms around the subject of Islam, in these maktabs around, particularly at the institutes like Dar el Uloom and other institutes in the south, madrasas that provide this kind of training. So I'm suggesting also that rather than offering only fragmentation, that creolization may in fact, which accommodating to circumstances and to other groups, may offer a way to actually provide or sort of support dialogue among different Muslim women's groups as well as different women's groups that are working toward what I would just say a broad agenda of women's rights. The roots and the understanding that people have may be different, but I think there is a common interest in pursuing women's rights. And I'm going to throw this out here as a final comment. I think it actually might provide what Gabby mentioned in our conference last year, a basis for indigenous feminist sovereignty. And I'm not talking about indigenous women per se, but a sort of a broad-based women's sort of collaboration among feminists of different backgrounds in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much. I'm sorry it takes so long, and look forward to questions.
So I'll go first, and then quickly exit. Thank you so much, Janet. Really interesting, and look forward to continuing this work. I guess I have one main thought to ask you about, or two, but they're related. One is decreolization the correct thesis, in the sense that, not critiquing it, I'm just asking, in the sense that I wonder if what's actually happening isn't decreolization per se, but an idea, but modernization, in the idea of what a correct, rational, globally relevant, up-to-date Islam looks like all the ways that being modern gets mobilized, and the way that the past gets characterized as muddled and culturally muddled and Hinduized and less correct than the present, right? So, but particular times in the past, right? So an earlier period of Islam in Trinidad, say prior to 1947, gets characterized as less correct than this modern form of Islam post 1970 something. And so I guess I'm wondering, is this a question of how an older Islam versus a newer, more modern Islam get set up and characterized as points of intervention? Whereas creolization, I think, is what you're describing. that they're seeking, that there's an attempt to seek a kind of way of living as a Muslim that allows you to be in a taxi or work in a job or be in the grocery or whatever, get on with life, as it is in Trinidad. And I ask that also because I wonder how getting knowledge, contemporary knowledge, and training allows you to counter the significance of old family status, right? So there are particular kinds of ways that oldness is deployed. Old family status is a big one. Old Muslim families with, as name for source authority, but also old ways of being Islam that now seem antiquated and somewhat wrong, slightly wrong. Our ancestors, our grandparents didn't have quite the right interpretation that we, more knowledgeable, we in some way or another have now. And so I guess I'm wondering more, is it different ways of deploying past and present? Particular points in tradition versus particular locations that constitute modernity, rather than creolization or decreolization at all.
Well, the terms creolization and decreolization, I recognize, are somewhat awkward because people associate them with different kinds of studies. But in terms of the dynamism of trying to purify versus allow for variation, those terms seem to capture that. And I agree with you that an aspect of decreolization, I think, is sort of the global pressure to conform to what people see as the correct Islam. And you may think that is part of modernity or not. One woman, older woman from a more elite family that I interviewed in and I've continued to see these 15 years, originally told me that she was so proud to live in Trinidad and Tobago as a Muslim. It was a modern society, meaning it wasn't a place that oppressed women like Iran, and in her view, like Iran did. And it was a place with a British legal tradition which focused on monogamy. But fast forward now, and she's gone to more classes, and the last few years has been talking, also because of things that have happened in her own family, but she's been talking about, plural marriage was part of Islamic tradition, it's correct, the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran allow for it, and so on. So this is seen as, yes, part of correct knowledge. I'm not sure whether people would really see it as modern or not, but I agree that there is, with the circulation of pious knowledge since the Iranian Revolution, I think really there has been this focus on standardization and trying to figure out what is correct. But there's divergent opinion in terms of what that means. And the reason that I would stick with something like decreolization and creolization is that, going back to Al-Zain, who wrote a piece on the anthropology of Islam, and also to Mahdavi, who wrote something about this in 2011, seeing what they say is a cyclical nature of reform and change in Islam, so that there have been these periods historically when people have rethought sort of what it meant to be a Muslim, how they were to apply the knowledge, and this has ebbed and flowed. One Trinidadian said to me the other day, this is a natural part of Islam. As Islam moved to China and to Latin America and other places, it was accommodating local practice. And Al-Zain suggested in the search for Islam as a concrete, essentialized thing, although believers feel that it is something that one can say is bounded in nature, that it has not been, that there's been so much variation and change historically, that in an accommodation to circumstances and to people's needs, that this is a part, that you might even say any religion, but particularly Islam, could be thought of as a creolized religion in that sense, although that would be offensive to many Muslims to say that. But looking at historical process, these men suggest that there is this ebb and flow in reform and change and rethinking of Islam. I also failed to mention, as I'm thinking about spreading to Latin America, that among the converts that I have interviewed are a number of Latinas in Trinidad. So Islam conversions in Latin America, of course, are increasing, but you also have that as part of the texture and diversity of Trinidadian Islam as well. And the conversion classes are very interesting, or not conversion classes, but classes for new or newer Muslims, those who are not born into a Muslim family, are very interesting because people are they're deliberately and consciously trying to learn their religion, and so you get a different view than those born into Islam. Other questions?
I just find it's interesting the diversity that you talk about, and even in Trinidad and Tobago, the ebb and flow of the creolization and decreolization. So I just found that as interesting. Yeah.
I should mention that I did make up a short bibliography if anybody is interested in sort of Islamic feminism beyond Trinidad, so some comparative sources that might be interesting. And then I'll leave these books with the library here. Of course, the history of Islam in Trinidad and Tobago and the context here make a difference also in how people engage traditions. So, for example, in my work with Iranians, especially outside of Iran in diaspora, because of the particular way the state has enforced certain kinds of practices, there is sort of a problematic relationship between Iranians and their faith, particularly those outside of Iran right now.
So there's a reaction against the tightening that has happened.
The enforcement of religious practices
yes.
by the state, whereas in of course in Germany or Canada, and also here, people have a lot more opportunity to understand their faith and practice it the way they want to. Someone might say there's more choice, whereas in Iran, particularly publicly, you have to behave and act in a particular way. Women have to wear some kind of covering that you would say is call hijab, some kind of Muslim, some kind of covering that's appropriate with respect to Muslim covering. That varies a great deal in terms of style and so on, but women are women of all nationalities who visit, or different religious faiths who live in Iran have to wear that in public. So there's much more surveillance of behaviors there. So I think the sort of multicultural context in Trinidad is quite interesting, because most people live in families where they have relatives by marriage or birth who practice other religious traditions, and it makes a big difference in the climate here for Muslims practicing their faith.
Any other questions of Professor Bauer?
Thank you so much. You can come up afterwards and ask questions too. Make corrections, observations.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Bauer, for this insightful lunchtime presentation, and thank you all for coming. giving up your lunch to be here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next lunchtime seminar next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, right here. Thank you all. Take care.